Welcome back to Connect and Transform. We're continuing the series where we're creating a game of checkers from scratch. In the last two videos, we created the board and pieces. In this video, we're probably not going to be doing as much actual programming, and instead we'll be focusing more on planning and scaffolding. So for example, thinking about what kind of global variables or game state we would need to keep track of, thinking about which functions we're likely to need, and that will probably change in the future, but I think it's important to begin planning and thinking ahead before we jump in with both feet for too many videos. So one thing I'm thinking is it might be nice to have an informational box, maybe to the right of the board, and that's for two reasons. One is just to provide you with information on which player's turn it is, how many valid moves there are, whether or not someone has won, things like that. So just purely from a utilitarian sense, I think it makes sense to have an informational box. And I think it also makes sense to have that box be on the right, because then the board will remain anchored at 0, 0 with respect to the top left, so we won't have to do any adjustments to anything we've already done there. So on the right-hand side of the screen, very top line, we're going to increase the width of the canvas a little bit from 800 to 960. And we're not going to have to do any adjustments to anything that we've done so far. We're going to duplicate this pieces container element, and we're going to create a container element for information. And we are going to apply a transformation. And that transformation will be a translation, or a repositioning. So we're going to position the information box container 800 pixels over on the x-axis and 0 on the y-axis. That will shift the box over to be at the right of the board. In this case, we're not going to self-close that container because we're going to add some child elements to it. One thing we're going to add is we will add just a simple rectangle. And we're going to fill it with white, but it's going to have a width and it's going to have a height. So the width is going to be 160, which is the amount that we increased the total SVG canvas by, and the height will be 800, which is the total height of our SVG canvas. We're going to fill it with white. We're going to have a stroke. We're going to have a stroke width. And I think our stroke width is just going to be 1, and for the stroke, we'll probably just make it a light gray. And I think that will probably do it for that. So I'm going to go ahead and save on the right-hand side and refresh on the left. Okay. Oh, I used the wrong verb. This is supposed to be translate, not translation. So let me save it again, refresh. Okay, so now we see just to the right of our checkers board, we see a white rectangle with a light gray surround. And so we'll use that as a container for our information. So now let's add some placeholder information. So we'll add some text. And so for example, maybe we want to keep track of whose turn it is. So we'll say current turn. And we're going to give this an X and a Y position. I think I'll just start with 50, 50. And that will be with respect to its parent element. So it's already going to be shifted over 800. So this is 50, 50 within this container. Let's go ahead and duplicate that. And then we'll just have a placeholder here. Maybe we'll push it down about 20 pixels, one line of text. And we're going to give this one an ID because this is one of the fields that we're going to be updating. So maybe we'll call this info current turn. We might go back and change that later. What else might we need to store? We might need to store the number of valid moves. So let's think of a way to say that is concise enough to fit in 160 pixels. And then maybe we'll shift that down another 100 pixels because that's kind of a different group. And then we'll do a similar thing where we'll just have a placeholder here. We'll shift it down 20. Moves possible. Okay, and then maybe finally we'll keep track of a winner, and then we can move on to another part of the project here. So winner, we'll shift this group down 100 pixels, 100 pixels, winner. Okay. That's probably good enough for now. We'll save that. We'll refresh over here. Okay, so that doesn't look as good as I was hoping. So let's change the X positioning from 50 to 30 on all 6 of these. Save it, refresh. Okay, that's a little more reasonable. So we'll just kind of keep that there for later. The other thing I realized is that this heading is at 50, this one's at 170, so they're 120 apart, whereas this one's at 170 and this one's at 270, so they're only 100 apart. So I'm going to push this down and this down so that the spacing of these 3 groups is equal. So that looks better to my eye. Okay, now let's move on to some scaffolding. So another thing we're going to need is we're going to need some CSS, most likely, especially now that we've added some actual XML text elements. So style, and we'll define the type, text CSS. Now, one thing I might do is I'm going to go back over to the SVG that I used in my first video, which is not related to checkers, where I'm pulling in an external font file, a free font, and then I'm applying some default styles to all the text. So I'm just going to copy those 2 lines of code over to there, and I've copied this file and I've placed it at the appropriate relative location to the current scaffolding SVG that we're working on. And so what this is doing is this is referencing this file, and it's saying that font file we're going to call this name. And then this line is saying all text elements, the ones that we just added, they're going to default to using this type of font, and they're going to default to whatever font size. So maybe I'll change that to, we'll say 14 for now, and I'll get rid of this for now. So let's save that. We'll go over to the left, refresh. Okay, that's not, let's make it a little bigger. The font is good for a thumbnail. I wouldn't say it's the best for this particular application, but I wanted to demonstrate that you can pull in your own fonts. You don't have to use ones that happen to be installed on your system. Okay, so now we've got our style tag. We have the future ability to easily add some CSS. We've pulled in a font and defined 1 or 2 default font attributes. Now, another thing I want to pull in, I'm going to switch back over to the SVG from my first video. I want to pull in this boilerplate attribute here. And what this will do is not only would it allow you to reference external images, it also allows you to interact with the URL and pull in things like URL parameters. One of the things that I'm thinking about with respect to scaffolding and planning is I may want to have different game modes, like human be human, machine be machine, machine be human, and it might be convenient to have a URL parameter to be able to set the mode. For example, if you were to embed this SVG in another page. And so in order to use URL parameters, you have to have this boilerplate attribute on the SVG element. So we've just added that now to our scaffolding SVG. So let's continue with scaffolding and planning. One thing I'm noticing here is that in a previous video, I'm referencing these two container elements through queries, and then I'm assigning them to a constant. And my naming is not as consistent as it could have been. So I'm going to update board to board container. And then I'm going to update the one and only reference to it at this point. So that we'll just kind of clean up the code a little bit, and then maybe I'll add a little bit of spacing here just to separate out constants from function calls from the actual functions. Okay, now at the bottom of the screen, actually, let's not do the bottom of the screen. That might be harder to follow. Middle of the screen, let's start thinking of some functions that we might need. So one thing that's obvious is we need to figure out what all the available moves are for a given piece. So let's say function get all moves for a given piece. And I don't think we're going to get to the point of actually figuring out what parameters, but maybe that takes an ID. I don't think I'm going to put the parameters in for now. I'm just going to put in the function names. So we're going to get all moves for one piece, and then maybe there will be one get all moves for all pieces. We probably could have also just named it get all moves. Okay, what else might we need? We might need a way to translate. So given a position like 1, 1 or 2, 5, 7, 7, we might need a way to translate between the board square and the piece. So we'll say get piece from board location. And that might take an XY, or it might take an ID, because you'll remember that for the ID of the board square, the one I have highlighted here, we've embedded the X and Y in that ID attribute. And same with the pieces. We've also embedded the X and Y and which team they're on and the fact that it's a piece versus a board square. All of that is embedded one way or another in the ID. So it's possible that this parameter could be ID or it could be XY. And that's part of why I'm not really going to fill in the parameters yet. So we have get piece from board location, and then we're going to have the inverse. We're going to have get board square from piece location. We're probably going to need some, well, we're going to need to be able to extract the team that the piece is on. Maybe. And we may also need to determine if two pieces are on the same team. And so this may, for example, take ID1 and ID2 of two pieces. We also probably need a function to determine whether or not a piece is a king. Apologies. Okay, I'm going to say is piece kinged. What else might we need? We Okay, we might need a function to determine whether or not we are still within the bounds of the board. I'm trying to decide whether that should be embedded logic inside of this. So for example, if I gave a location of, let's talk about something crazy like 50-50. I mean, obviously the board is 8 by 8. So this location should not return any pieces. Oh, but we're not, okay. We're not doing a translation from a board to a piece or from a piece to a board. So we do need another function basically bounds checking. Yeah, so is within bounds, maybe. I don't like the name. Okay, but we'll have something like that. And then we probably also want a function to actually do the changing of turns. So we'll say turn change. So anything that should happen at the tick-tock, between different turns can happen there. We may have one update information because we added that information box to the right of the board. So we'll probably have a function specifically to update that data. And then maybe when someone wins, maybe we'll have like an overlay with some fireworks or something. So show end game screen. Okay, and then I'm thinking that, so kind of similar to how we have translation functions from piece to board and board to piece, and then we have this function is the board within bounds. I think we also need a function now for whether or not a piece exists at a given location. So is piece present at board location? And then maybe I'll change this bounds checking one to be is board present at location. So what else do we need? Well, if we're doing machine versus machine or human versus machine, we probably need some sort of auto move function. And then we probably also need both a heuristic and a strategy. And there might be some recursive functions. We might have to add some helper functions, but for now we're just scaffolding out the very high levels. So I'm just going to call it heuristic and strategy for now. And then we need some more functions. So we need like apply move or maybe move to. Okay, so we'll have a function to move a piece ID. That's probably what we'll pass into it. And then we'll move the piece to a given location. And based on the XY of the piece ID and the XY of the destination, that will allow us to determine the direction of moves. And so I think now we need to have, we're going to have move piece northwest and then northeast, southwest, and southeast. And then we're also going to have jumps. So we'll say jump piece northwest, northeast, southwest, and southeast. And then we do need one more function at least. We'll call this one king me, or it could be promote piece to king. I like that name, so we'll keep it for now. And that might be about everything that we need functions for. Let's think about global variables. Okay, so we're just going to comment these out because we're not writing real code today. So we're going to have a game mode, which could be, you know, human-human, human-machine, or machine-machine, and this is just pseudocode here. In addition to game mode, we're probably going to track the current turn. Which would be a team or a direction. So the direction might be +1 or -1. And then we'll have like a current selection, which would be a piece and a board square. And maybe we need to track whether the game is over. It could be true or false. And we'll probably have an array for animations. Because animations usually work better when you queue them and you run one and then you run the next and then you run the next. And I think that'll pretty much do it. So far, we've only figured out 2 functions. We've generated the board and we've generated the pieces. As we can see, there's a lot left to be done. Now, a lot of these are going to be very simple, like is piece king? Oh, there's 2 of these. Well, I may have had an extra. Is piece king? There's probably going to be a simple one. Pieces are allies will be very simple because the team is embedded directly in the ID, and I think it's also in the class list. So some of these might just be a line or 2. Some of these might be more involved, like moving and especially jumping is probably going to queue a lot of animations, and that'll involve delays and timing and callbacks and maybe a little recursion or setting a timeout to another function call. So things will get more complicated. But I think this is a good job scaffolding. I'm going to go ahead and save, and I'll refresh one last time and just make sure that there's no errors in the console, and there are not. So we still have a functional SVG as far as we've built it. I think this has been a successful planning session, and we'll continue in future videos by actually completing some of these functions a few at a time. And that'll do it. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.